All right, so we'll get started now. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the student panel on health equity for today's Insulin 100 Symposium. My name is Lindsay McLennan, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour. I'll start by introducing myself and the panelists, who are all so excited to be part of this year's celebration of excellence and engagement, and then we'll begin the panel. So to start, I am a first-year student at the Lawrence S. Bloomberg Faculty of Nursing and the Vice President of the Nursing Undergraduate Society at the University of Toronto. I have a Master's of Science in Anatomical Sciences from Queen's University, during which my thesis pertained to concussion intervention literature, specifically providing a quantitative summary of its diagnostic and outcome measures. I also have a Bachelor of Sciences with a major in Life Sciences from Queen's University. I'm connected to today's panelists through the university's Allied for Essential Medicines, or UAEM for short, University of Toronto chapter, for which I am the Director of Finances. A little bit about the UAEM as an organization. It's a global conglomerate of post-secondary students who advocate for health equity-related policy change through grassroots movements at their academic institutions. The panelists will further discuss UAEM's goals and campaigns, but for now, I'll introduce the panelists themselves. First, we begin with Negin. Negin Khosraviani is a third-year PhD candidate in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology at U of T. Her research explores a new function of the BRCA1 gene in genome stability and cancer. Negin learned about UAEM's work with regards to health equity and decided to join the University of Toronto chapter, where she is now the vice president. Welcome, Negin. Next, we have Yasmin. Yasmin Badakshi is a previous graduate student at the University of Toronto in the endocrinology division of the physiology department. She first became involved with UAEM in 2015 at Western University as an undergraduate student, and later within the UAEM North American Coordinating Committee during her master's degree at the University of Toronto. She is currently a first-year student at the Renaissance School of Medicine at Stony Brook University in Stony Brook, New York, and aims to implement mechanisms to minimize health disparities by advocating for equitable technology transfer of essential medicines. Welcome to you, Yasmin. And finally, we have Sterling. Sterling Lewis is a second-year master's degree student enrolled in the Translational Research Program at the University of Toronto. He has been passionate about working to make change in health equity since he began his journey as Director of Logistics and Finances with UAEM at Queen's University. Sterling is now the president of the University of Toronto chapter of UAEM. Through his program, Sterling is currently researching methods to improve the use of specific medications in underrepresented and minoritized groups within Canada. Welcome, Sterling. So we'll start off this panel with a bit of an icebreaker to set up the panelists. And so our question is, Humalog was priced at $21 in 1996. Oh, it says, sorry, that slide is wrong, not 1999, but rather 1996. What do you all think the price was in 2019? You can comment that in the chat, or you can just think of it yourselves. Regardless, the answer is $332 is what it cost in 2019. And so on that, let's start with Negin and insulin's past. So what are the origins of insulin production? And what did we get, and how did we get from $21 in 1996 to $332 in 2016?
Thank you, Lindsay. So this is a great question that to answer will go all the way back to December 30th, 1921, during which Eli Lilly and Co. Company, one of the American companies that manufacture and distribute insulin, they were first introduced to Banting and Best's work with insulin at the American Physiological Society. So during that time, they recognized the potential for this research and asked the Toronto group to collaborate with them and prepare the extract commercially. Back then, they were turned down by the group. Fast forwarding to 1922, the Toronto team then decided to manufacture insulin on a larger scale and finance and administrate it with the help of the Connaught laboratories here in Toronto. They were having problems producing insulin in large quantities, and that's when they decided to accept the offer to collaborate with Eli Lilly and Co. in mid-May of that year. With this collaboration, the university also accepted the rights in patent rights here in Canada and United States. So then an American patent was awarded to Banting, Best, and Collip for both insulin and Toronto's method of making it. And they sold this patent to University of Toronto's Board of Governors for only $1 Canadian in January 23rd, 1923. And for the reason they sold it at $1 Canadian was, as Banting believed, he said, insulin belongs to the world, not me. So since then, Eli Lilly began selling insulin, which they named Ileton, at 5 cents per unit. So for context, an average diabetic requires about 20 units per day. So they would be paying around $1 per day for the insulin vial back then in 1920. And the average per capita annual income in Canada back then was close to $500. So then by the end of November that year, the new Connaught lab was able to produce 250,000 units of insulin weekly, which they named Insulin Toronto as a way to differentiate from Eli Lilly's insulin Ileton. And this mass production of Insulin Toronto allowed them to drop the insulin price from 5 cents per unit to 2 cents per unit. They were also able to export this insulin globally from Toronto to Ireland, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia, as well as to several other countries without their own production facilities. So the price continued to drop to 1 cent per unit by June 1924 and remained so for 1 year after that. And because of this increasing production capacity and improved methodology at Connaught, the price of insulin in Canada continued to drop until the end of November 1935. And then in 1936, a longer lasting insulin named protamine zinc insulin was introduced by the Connaught laboratories, which they priced at 26 cents per 100 units in 1939. The price of the regular insulin, Insulin Toronto at the time, was 22 cents, which then dropped to 20 cents per 100 units, so even cheaper in 1942, at which that's at the price which it remained for the next 25 years.
So within the first 20 years of production, insulin prices were decreasing from 2 to 5 cents per unit in 1920 to then 1 cent per unit in 1924, and then even less than that to about a fifth to a quarter of a cent per unit in 1942, and those lower prices stuck until late 1960s, early 1970s. So what happened thereafter? When did prices start increasing?
Great question, Lindsay. So during the 1970s, what happened is that the global insulin industry transformed significantly as new types of human and insulin, synthetic insulin were developed using recombinant DNA technology. And then in 1990s, you have insulin analogs that were introduced to the market. So these new variations allow for the continual increase in insulin price over the years. And now 90% of the global insulin production is now carried by American company Eli Lilly, the French company Sanofi, and the Danish firm Novo Nordisk. So in 1996, when Eli Lilly introduced its Humalog brand of insulin, the price of a 10 milliliter vial was $21. The price of the same vial now is $275. Sanofi's popular insulin, Lantus, was $35 a vial when it was introduced back in 2001. It's now $270. And Novo Nordisk's Novolog was priced at $40 in 2001. And as of July 2018, it's $289. So as you can see, the prices have just increased exponentially.
Thank you so much, Nadine, for explaining, including its production and its increasing costs. Now to Yasmin. Can you explain why insulin prices are rising?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you so much, Lindsay. So Humalog, Lantus, and the other previous generation of insulins that Negin mentioned should now be off patent, and even older animal-based insulin should be off patent too at this stage. So it really is a good question. Why is insulin still so expensive? The exact answer to this question is multifaceted, and I'd like to take some time to sort of address all of the several causes that have been proposed. So the issue with the rise in insulin prices compared to other pharmaceutical products is that there technically is competition for insulin. In most industries, we would expect competition to drive down the price of a certain product. However, in the case of insulin, the competitors that we mentioned earlier appear to be increasing the prices side by side. And if you could go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you so much. These two graphs are an example of that, showing Lantus and Levmir throughout the 2000s and how the price has been increasing, as well as Humalog and Novolog, and side by side, so the rapid acting and the long acting insulins. And we can see here that although they have been both on the market for a very long time and they are competitors of each other, instead of the prices going down, the prices seem to be going up as the years go by. So with regards to high pharmaceutical prices of older drugs, a lot of experts typically point to a term called evergreening. So this refers to trying to refresh the monopoly protection on a drug with already market exclusivity. About 78% of drugs that are associated with new patents in the FDA's records between 2005 and 2015 were not new drugs coming on the market, but actually existing drugs. And companies are able to develop new formulations, dosage schedules, and different combinations in a way that could justify obtaining new patents or exclusivity protections. For example, Sanofi has filed 74 patent applications on Lantus alone, meaning that Sanofi has created the potential for a competition-free monopoly for 37 years. And to reflect further on this, a company called Merck announced their plans to sell a similar biosimilar or generic version of Sanofi's Lantus, but Sanofi sued Merck back in 2016, and eventually Merck announced that it was no longer pursuing this biosimilar production. And at the time, they did have their pending FDA approval. Another issue with generic insulin entering the market to drive down costs is that insulin itself, at the formulation that is being sold now, is a therapeutic biological product, or also known as a biologic, meaning that it cannot be made as the same way that other generic types of molecules can be made. And because of this, there is little market incentive to produce biosimilars because they cost nearly as much as making the new drug, and companies must go through all of the approval stages and trials that a new drug is required to go through. And even with that, seeing from the possibility for the current versions of things like Lantus that exist could still sue the companies that are making the biosimilars, and it may not be possible to be creating those biosimilars in the first place to enter the market. Beyond that, many individuals in the US also look to a structure called pharmacy benefit managers that negotiate the drug pricing with drug manufacturers as a cause of high prices. In the US, there is a constant battle of where to pass the blame with unaffordable insulin, from PBMs to manufacturers to then insurance companies.
Can you give us some insight on why blame is being passed between the pharmacy benefit managers, manufacturers, and insurance companies? Why is there so much confusion?
Sure. So I think a lot of confusion comes from when each of those entities is asked the reasoning for the high insulin prices. They do not give a clear answer, and there's no transparency between what types of prices are actually being set and negotiated. To give a little bit of insight on this confusion, a report was published by the Insulin Access and Affordability Working Group back in 2018, where a lot of the stakeholders in determining insulin pricing were interviewed. And during that publication, a lot of manufacturers reported that without the knowledge of negotiations that take place between PBMs and health plans, they are essentially at a disadvantage in determining prices for their insulin products. Manufacturers also stated that they needed to provide a higher rebate to achieve the preferred formulas that they wanted for their insulin production, but they don't really have an idea of to where the extra profits from these increased rebates go. On the other hand, health plans stated that while there's no requirements to report factors that determine increasing prices of insulin, individuals are paying for most of those costs as prices continue to rise. And at the end of the study, the working group concluded that there's really a lack of transparency between all parties involved in how these prices are determined. And it was still unclear after the several rounds of interviews how much each group actually profits from the manufacturers. And in the majority of these cases, the discounts that are negotiated between PBMs and manufacturers, and then later between PBMs and pharmacies, which will affect the total cost of insulin for individuals with diabetes, are all confidential. On the other side to that, a study in 2018 that was published in the BMJ Global Health Fund that the cost to produce one vial of human insulin is estimated at this point between $2.28 to $3.42 USD, and the cost of producing one vial of analog insulin is about $3.69 to $6.16 in USD. So a very drastic price to the market costs that we're seeing in this graph today.
We hear a lot of talk about what's going on in the United States, understandably, because of the pharmaceutical prices and obviously the price of insulin. But what about the global situation with insulin production and pricing?
Right, that's a really good point. And I think we do tend to focus a lot on the States because it's impacting individuals, a lot of individuals that have to pay out of pocket, that have been rationing insulin, and several really unfortunate isolated stories about individuals that have passed away because they were rationing their insulin amounts. But looking beyond the States, access and equity in low and middle income countries after a century of insulin discovery is still extremely low. So these values are according to the World Health Organization, and they state that globally, only 1 in 2 people with type 2 diabetes have access to the insulin that they require. And insulin also remains unaffordable beyond inaccessible to many people globally. Again, this is cited from the WHO that say that in countries like Zambia, the annual cost of insulin for individuals that was reported back in 2003 was about $26 US in the public sector and about $218 US in the private sector. However, even at $26 US a year of for insulin really can't be afforded by most individuals in a country like Zambia, where about 70% of the population live below the international poverty line of about $1.25 US a day. And on top of that, in a lot of countries similar to Canada, where the government or the health ministries are purchasing insulin from the manufacturers directly, unlike the US that has the PBMs involved as well, high insulin costs can still be an increasing financial burden on health systems that provide this insulin to their population. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the consequences of that, because learning about all of this personally has made me feel like this act is, very much unjust, and we really don't know who to hold responsible and how to ensure that someone here takes accountability for the rising insulin prices. So to this date, several lawsuits that have alleged some form of price fixing has been ongoing. The first lawsuit was filed back in 2017, claiming that prices of Lantus, Levemir, Novolog, and Humalog have increased by more than 160% in the last 5 years, while the prices offered to pharmacy benefit managers have stayed constant or even decreased. And later in 2018, Minnesota became the first state to sue the companies over insulin prices, making similar claims. The companies, of course, have denied the suit's allegations, but it's really interesting to see what the outcome of these trials will be in the future.
How do you think these high prices have impacted different groups in the US and Canada?
Right. Yeah, so it definitely is also imperative to discuss the patients from lower socioeconomic groups having difficulty accessing a lot of hospital-based services, but also general lack of access to diabetes medication beyond insulin. A few ways in which socioeconomic position might influence health outcomes in diabetes can be due to lack of access to care and process of care. A lot of patients may have barriers to accessing services like work-related factors, lifestyles, and transportation issues, which they have reported as hindering their access to a lot of hospital-based services. And some patients have also reported that they can't be paid if they take time off work, and this further discourages their attendance to follow up with a lot of their diabetes treatment and continuous care that they require. So to respond to this from some of the diabetes associations, in July of 2020, the American Diabetes Association launched a campaign referred to as the Health Equity Bill of Rights. And this was really in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this Bill of Rights addresses this current health pandemic and the fact that it has a disproportionate toll on minoritized, low-income, and historically underserved individuals in the states, which highlights a lot of the historic systemic inequalities in the American healthcare system. And this Bill of Rights aims to lessen a lot of unjust health disparities by stating that every individual must have the right to several healthcare needs, primarily affordable insulin, as well as other essential medications. Now in Canada, while the price of insulin itself is more affordable for individuals, people with diabetes face several barriers to accessing treatment that are not covered by provincial or private healthcare plans, a lot of which have been touched on in the previous talk to ours as well. But to just touch upon them briefly, a lot of variations in public, private, and out-of-pocket payments have caused a lot of barriers to coverage across the country that affect not just the medication itself, but things like test strips, syringes, needles, and other glucose monitoring devices. So these gaps in access lead to challenge in receiving adequate treatment and can lead to a lot of unwanted diabetes complications in individuals here in Canada. These treatments and services and supplies that are required to manage diabetes also create an unjust financial burden on a lot of people that are living with the disease. And this burden is more so disproportional in individuals in lower socioeconomic status. So to address this, the Canadian Diabetes Association similarly outlines the barriers to care that for Canadians living with diabetes. And this states that people with diabetes have the right to receive care that promotes the highest quality of life, regardless of whether they receive care in the public, in the hospital, or any other institutional settings.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for your insight into just the current situation and issues surrounding insulin pricing. I'll turn to our final panelist, Sterling Lewis, and ask the very important question. Since our current position concerning insulin is less than ideal, what are we doing to remedy the situation?
That's a great question, Lindsay. And before I answer that, I want to just state a couple of things. First, you'll notice that we'll be transitioning to a slide that is outlining the usual pathway for monetization of innovations within an academic institution. While this might not be too relevant at the beginning, its relevance will become clear towards the end, so please bear with that. And secondly, 90% of the diabetes cases in Canada are type 2, which means that 90% of the diabetes cases in Canada could be prevented. So one of the large pushes in both Canada and the US is to change culture. And they try to achieve this goal by targeting children. And they try to provide them with additional nutritional knowledge, as well as exercise knowledge, to prevent them from becoming pre-diabetics and eventually diabetics. In Canada, one of the best known movements for this is the School Health Framework. And in the States, its parallel is Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign. And I want to briefly speak about both of those movements, as we probably are a little more familiar with the Let's Move campaign, moreover than the School Health Framework. Considering we're Canadians, this is not ideal. And the reason why the Let's Move campaign was so much more impactful is due to the fact that Michelle Obama partnered with soda pop companies, and some gave her a little bit of pushback for this. But what she did was she brought all stakeholders to the table to have a true conversation, and she increased her funding. And I think that increased funding is probably why the Let's Move campaign is much more known than the School Health Framework. But targeting culture generally is slow and arduous. And that causes it to lack feasibility. Most importantly, we also need solutions now, not in 20 plus years. And another important piece, Lindsay, is what about type 1 diabetics who will not benefit from nutritional or exercise paradigm shifts?
Yeah, like you said, cultural shifts, they take a long time, 20 plus years. So beyond a cultural shift, are we working towards a more tangible solution, a more short-term solution?
Yes, we definitely are. And I'll begin with Canada in speaking to this. So in Canada, the Patent Medical Review Board took the bold step of setting a maximum list price for a dose of insulin. While this price is still high compared to many other countries, it's much lower than the US. As you mentioned earlier, a vial of Humalog costs about $300 plus in the US. In Canada, that'd be $32, ranging about a tenth of the price. So does that mean that the insulin issue is fixed in Canada? No, and that is due to the fact that we do not drink insulin. We need equipment to administer a dose. And there are no maximums set on the cost of insulin-related equipment. To frame this, an insulin pump, for example, ranges from around $6,000 to $8,000, and your normal insurance and OHIP would not cover this. While in Canada, we do have an assistive device program to help pay for these fees. First, you must show that daily injections are not working effectively. For those of us who know about the symptoms of insulin, if our diabetes care is not working effectively, we're undergoing irreversible renal damage. So it's not preferable to have to undergo irreversible damage to be able to be administered into this assistive device program. And what's more is that typically they would only have type 1 diabetics be part of this program. While there are some exceptions, generally that would exclude about 90% of people living with insulin from the assisted device program. So this is definitely a large barrier to care in Canada. In the US, on the other hand, the Affordable Care Act contained many components to combat insulin prices. To speak to one, the value-based insurance design was meant to reduce costs by incentivizing valuable interventions. And a valuable intervention is basically an intervention that is given at the least cost and gives you the most benefit. And while this was a lofty goal, unfortunately, they fell a little short of this. They did experience some limited success in that they did increase the total amount of benefit given to patients, but they were not able to reduce prices. Another big step taken by the ACA was the Biologics Price Competition Innovation Act. So as Yasmin had alluded to earlier, insulin is a biologic. It's not a small molecule drug like Tylenol, for example. And as Yasmin had mentioned, this means that typically you would have to go through basically an entirely new clinical trial to have a generic enter the market. The Biologics Price Competition Innovation Act reduces some of this barrier, but it doesn't reduce it to the same point of a small molecule drug where you can use the efficacy and evidence from the brand name to justify generic. So there's still some work to be done there. And since the Obama era, of course, there's been lots of work done, most of which was undertaken by Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and to a much lesser extent, even Donald Trump. So I'll begin speaking about Elizabeth Warren's movements towards more affordable healthcare and insulin. So she began the Affordable Drug Manufacturing Act, which proposes a self-sustaining office of drug manufacturing within the Department of Health and Human Services. Basically, this office can make generic drugs for any US government licensed patent. Meaning basically if you have a generic or a drug that is has little or no competition, if there's a shortage, or if it's being listed at an exorbitant price, then you could begin nationalizing production. While Elizabeth did not clearly define what exorbitant price is, if you pair her act with the act by Bernie Sanders, you can find that exorbitant is very well defined. So Bernie Sanders proposed the Prescription Drug Price Relief Act. This act would end the patent monopoly for any drug sold for a price higher than the median of 5 other major countries, being Canada, the UK, France, Germany, and Japan. Currently, median drug prices in these countries are approximately half of the price of drugs in the US. So this is kind of quantifying what exorbitant is. And basically, in the current state, almost all drug prices in the US would have to be halved to be able to operate within this act. Bernie also proposed 2 other acts, the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Act, which was basically allowing for Medicare to negotiate for drug prices as a collective purchase, which gives them quite a bit of bargaining power, as Medicare roughly spends $100 billion per year on prescription drugs. And the last act would be the Affordable and Safe Prescription Drug Importation Act. So if any of us were following the news cycles about a year or 2 ago, Bernie Sanders had accompanied multiple Americans in what we were calling a caravan to Canada to afford insulin. This act would basically allow the caravan to be dissolved, and instead they could import insulin from Canada to the States. With all these acts currently being introduced, it begs the question, why is this problem not already fixed? And the reason it hasn't been fixed yet is because none of these acts have actually passed the Senate. And after passing the Senate, of course, they must pass the House, be approved by the president, and then become law. And to speak about the president, Donald Trump had actually proposed to cut out the PBMs that Yasmin had mentioned earlier. So as Yasmin mentioned, PBMs will receive a rebate dependent on the price of drugs. The higher the price, the greater the rebate. So they have a vested interest in ensuring that drug prices are high, to the direct detriment of the average American. While this sounded like a great thing to do for Donald Trump, unfortunately, this has also not passed the proposal stage. And just to quickly present both sides of the coin, Trump has also simultaneously hired multiple big pharma lobbyists and executives in his administration. So his intents are not exactly clear. But that was a great question, Lindsay.
There seems to be a strong case for nationalizing drug production in the US, but what about Canada? Where is Canada on the subject of nationalizing drug production?
Yes, so yeah, there's definitely a case in Canada as well, but it's an ongoing debate. So to speak to what Nagin had mentioned a little earlier, historically, Connaught Labs, which was a Canadian company, shipped insulin globally for minimal markups. It was basically providing the solution to the current gap in need that we're seeing in today's times. Unfortunately, since then, we've offshored all of our lab manufacturers to the point that we have one generic injectable manufacturing lab left in Canada, and that is situated in Quebec. And even operating at optimal functionality as it's missing active pharmaceutical ingredients, or basically the precursors to the medications it needs. So during the pandemic, what we've seen is that in Canada, we've been undergoing quite a few medication shortages. This is due to the fact that our main exporters of medications like India and China are prioritizing the population, the safety of their own populations, and therefore they're exporting a little less. So for us to be able to nationalize our production so that we could also prioritize the safety of our populations, we would actually need to create two economies, not one. One for the manufacturing of the drugs themselves, and another for the manufacturing of the drug precursors. If you're wondering what the arguments against nationalizing production is, as I had mentioned, it's an ongoing debate, they typically would revolve around the costs, which personally I believe is not a very good argument. It sounds like a strawman argument, as during points where there's not a shortage, of course, manufacturers can export drugs and be able to recoup some costs. But all in all, there's still a debate, and we're not looking like we're going to be nationalizing our production of drugs anytime soon, Lindsay.
You've spoken a lot about the current proposals that may be passed soon, which is very valid. But are there any new ideas that haven't even made it to the governmental proposal stage yet?
Yeah, so that's a layered question, and it's definitely a great question. You're asking if there are any new ideas that haven't made it to the governmental proposal stage. And I'll argue that most of these ideas aren't new, but a lot of them have not made it to the governmental proposal stage. So UAM, which we're all a part of, the University's Allied for Essential Medicines group, they've been taking multiple steps towards trying to tackle this drug pricing problem from an academic institution's point of view. As you can see on the slide here, there are many steps from discovery to monetization. And the steps that UAM often targets are step 6, selecting a license, and step 9, revenue and reinvestment. So in selecting a license, what is their goal? Basically, they want non-exclusive licensing. But what is non-exclusive licensing, and why do we want it? So we pursue non-exclusive licensing to reform the regulatory and legal processes such that there is an easier path for biosimilars, like generic insulin, to enter the market to allow for greater competition that will hopefully lower prices. This is a vital stage of the commercialization process, where academic researchers can have power in the translation of scientific inventions. And some non-exclusive licensing deals, for example, the Equitable Technology Access Framework, is a policy developed by UAM to accomplish this goal. So this framework includes conditions that basically limit intellectual property protection and data exclusivity of a patented product to the shortest possible time period and the fewest numbers of countries. Basically, we're trying to reduce the total time a drug is monopolized and reduce the amount of areas in which it is monopolized. The other step that UAM often focuses on is step 9, which is revenue and reinvestment. And what they really try to suss out of this is alternative routes to research and development funding, which has actually been a hot subject of debate in the UN for over a decade now. So why are alternative routes to research and development funding important? Those who fund research have considerable power over its use. At times, knowing exactly where funding originated can be difficult due to transparency issues. At least half of the most innovative and life-saving medicines that exist today were originally developed in university labs with taxpayer funding. This includes not only insulin, but also most vaccines, as well as many HIV and tuberculosis drugs. Thus, the public should have access to information from pharmaceutical companies about the cost of R&D for the medical interventions and the price of medicines. Further, increased transparency regarding costs and outcomes of clinical trials conducted in the process of drug development are also necessary. And both of these sentiments are actually supported and advocated by the World Health Organization currently. So what could alternative routes to R&D look like? Well, you could have something that's an innovation inducement prize, which is basically a hackathon. And how would a hackathon be of benefit? Typically, we use the same funding models, which are very bureaucratic and often result in overspending. By having this hackathon-like structure, we'd be encouraging innovation and encouraging people to find maybe slightly more parsimonious ways of getting the same work done. Another potential is patent pools. And patent pools are very similar to non-exclusive licensing, but rather than academic institutions choosing who licenses which patent, you would have pharmaceutical companies forming a consortium of sorts where they would share patents. And this is beneficial because typically they're repaying each other for the use of one another's patents. But in doing the sharing, will hopefully reduce the total bureaucracy, or reduce the total amount of time taken between having an invention idealized and then having it actually commercialized. And hopefully all of this will cause to reduce in prices. Lastly, we could also have something like the open source research and product development partnership. And these actually began in the 90s around AIDS research. We see them most recently during the coronavirus pandemic. So what we've seen is that in 10 months, we were able to go from basically not knowing what the coronavirus 2 was to having multiple vaccines under works. And this was all due to these open source research and product development partnerships. All three of these basically have the same goal of attempting to de-link the cost of R&D from the final prices of medicines. And these are not new. So this is why I say, while there may not be new ideas, there are many useful ideas that have not made it to the governmental proposal stage yet. Hopefully with the support of academic institutions, lawmakers, and the populace, we can work towards implementing these to have drug equity realities rather than drug equity dreams.
Thank you so much to Nagin, Yasmin, and Sterling for presenting the information and giving us a lot to think about. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'll open up the discussion. So if anyone wants to send us a question via the chat, you can send it either to everyone so everyone can get a look at it and say whether or not they like that question and would like that answered, or you can send it to me privately if you're more comfortable with that. While you may think of questions or something may come up. Also, if you'd like to just unmute yourself and ask a question, that works as well. I was wondering if the panelists, any one of you would like to comment on, so we've talked a lot about insulin pricing, right? And the impact that it has on individuals. But something that I found very interesting is the impact that it has on small and medium businesses who may not necessarily have a drug plan. And I was wondering if any of you could comment on both the health issues that employees of small business and medium businesses have, as well as the economic issues that those businesses have with employees not being able to afford their insulin.
I can speak a little bit on this, just from the Canadian perspective, because I know that we do discuss a lot of issues currently present in the US. And of course, there's a lot of issues with insulin, both affordability and access in a lot of low and middle income countries. But I think the situation that we have in Canada in particular is a little bit different in the sense that insulin itself is not priced at such a high level as you see in the States. Obviously, we do not purchase insulin going through a middle PBM, or we do not have to go through our insurance companies. However, a lot of costs that start to add up for the Canadian public, especially those without insurance, are with the other supplies that have to go with insulin, things that Sterling was talking about a little bit as well. The vast amount of resources that you need to actually be able to manage type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So I think this is an ongoing issue, and it impacts Canadians at different variety of levels, depending what province they're in and the type of insurance plans they have. If anybody wants to add on to that in terms of like insurance in Canada, please, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, I could add a little bit in there. So as I had spoken about, typically your insulin-related equipment, for example, an insulin pump, which is one of the best ways to deliver insulin as it's more continuous, which is more similar to how your pancreas would act, which gives you a more natural state. We don't have access to them, but there are programs, right? Like the assisted device program. So that program seems great on the surface, and often people will look to that and say, okay, we've solved this issue. But when we look at the program availability, knowing that typically people of lower socioeconomic status, people of marginalized groups will have type 2 diabetes, not type 1 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes generally is about 90% of the cases that we see in Canada. This program is not doing a great job because it's excluding about 90% of the potential patients. So there are quite a few exceptions that are made, but at least I would suggest that we should take out that type 1 diabetes requirement for the program, as it's like an exclusionary, criteria that is making most Canadians think they cannot make use of this. And often people may not try to become an exception and attempt to go through the portal, even though they know they're not making the inclusion criteria right at the beginning. Often people may say, if I can't get it, I can't get it, and they go on to another option.
Yeah, and one of those other options that we've been noticing more and more is crowdfunding. So people creating GoFundMe pages for affording their, whether it's type 1 or type 2 diabetes, because either they don't have insurance or they're not covered by a government insurance and anything like that. So it's definitely valid. Can any of you speak to the larger issues of patents and drug company collusion? We saw so obviously in Yasmin's slide that there seems to be some sort of collusion. And are we seeing that elsewhere? Like, did it start in insulin or not?
Sorry, Yasmin, I see that you had muted yourself. I'll let you take this one.
I just wanted to kind of briefly mention, I know we haven't really gone into all kinds of essential medicines in this talk, and we really focused our efforts on insulin, but in terms of off patent or drugs that should be off patent at this point that are essential, similar types of issues with prices not being decreased as the length of time they are in the market has been seen. Some specific cases that have been brought up in the last few years have been issues with drugs like EpiPens, as well as several medication for multiple sclerosis. And it's kind of this, we see the similar thing that we've seen with insulin. Of course, there's a lot of like nuance that goes into all of these cases, as we've seen just with insulin alone, not even going into any of the other types of diabetes management drugs. But again, it is situations where there are drugs that should be off patent at this point, but they still remain to be unaffordable. But go ahead, Sterling.
I was just going to briefly speak about one of the probably biggest stories around drug company collusion that actually led to a litigation against the CEO, which is the story of Martin Shkreli with the AIDS drug, which was Daraprim. He increased the price by, I believe, 500% overnight, and he was persecuted for that. And I think he's currently still in jail. But the real question is, why did he think that was appropriate? And he advocates that every other pharmaceutical company is doing the same thing. So why was he the only one that was persecuted? Why were there not multiple CEOs who are currently in jail for these price fixing acts? It seems like it was because he was new to the game and he may not have realized how he's supposed to protect himself. But these other CEOs, the Sackler family comes to mind. They seem to have protected themselves to a point where they're in many ways above a reproach, which is exactly the opposite of what a legal system should be providing.
Right. And I think just to add on to that, I think, if I'm not mistaken, at the time what Shkreli did was within legal boundaries. So I think the bigger issue is that not the, the pharma companies themselves, of course, their major motive would be profit, but how are we going to effectively be able to create legitimate policies in place, both at the national level, international levels, but also see what changes we can make at our academic institutions, at our biomedical health funding agencies like the CIHR, in order to enable our taxpayer funded research to actually be accessible and equitable for people globally, so that someone like a researcher, which I'm sure many have spoken here today, but someone similar like Banting and Best, who wanted to see their drugs be accessible by everyone, actually be accessible by everyone 100 years later, and be able to have the power to produce some regulations on the manufacturing companies and be within the legal rights to do that as well.
Speaking about Martin Shkreli, I heard, I don't know if it's true, it might have been just a hot take, but apparently the reason why he increased his drug prices by 500% was to show that it wasn't illegal, when it should clear, like something like that. The drug price increased for no reason. There was no increase in the supplies, the cost of supplies, the cost of manufacturing. But to be fair, I mean, he still did sell those drugs for 500% higher, and he was still making that money. So I don't know how accurate that hot take is, that he was trying to prove that the legal system is needs to be changed in the United States.
Yeah, I've heard interpretations along those lines as well. And while I'm not sure how very veracious this is as well, or how truthful this is, but apparently he increased the price for Americans, while for lower, I guess, developing countries, as how I should phrase it, he hadn't increased the price nearly as much, which seems like, you can justify that as saying, oh, I'm still going to provide it to the people who really need it at a reduced price, and most Americans have insurance. And you can try to interpret it in all these different ways. What it comes down to is he was still making an increased profit for all those months before he was incarcerated for that. So it's hard to justify both, to say that he was trying to prove a point, and then also to be taking all of the revenue and treating it like the spoils of war. So yeah, I think in that regard, it's kind of hard to sell that idea. But I've heard that one as well.
On the topic that Yasmin brought up of universities creating these drugs, or in now the case would be vaccines, well, I believe UAEM has talked about how since the federal government has given a lot of funding to universities such as University of Toronto, that the patent should be very low priced, or it should be an open source patent. So that essentially Canadians do not have to pay twice for something that we've already funded through taxpayer money. I don't know if University of Toronto has agreed to such a thing, though.
So the Canadians won't be billed twice in the respect of having us actually pay for a vaccine. If you're a Canadian citizen, Trudeau having all vaccines distributed to all Canadian citizens free of charge, which is amazing. What's worrying about that is that we're forgetting about the many people who contribute to the Canadian economy, who have been here throughout the entire pandemic, and who are not currently Canadian citizens. So I think we need to open up our definition of who we're taking care of a little more, to basically be anybody that's contributing towards our economy and paying taxes. And that ties into the second piece, whereas that is kind of how we might be billed twice. While we won't be billed individually, if Trudeau's providing these vaccines to everyone, then of course he's doing that with taxpayer revenue. So yeah, we should definitely be looking at how much we're paying per dose of vaccine, even if those costs aren't being transferred directly to individual Canadians.
Yeah, and you provide oh, sorry, Yasmin, you can go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add on that there is, it's also very important to address how as we've been talking about today, it isn't just the drugs that are going to be covered by Canadians. There's a lot of out-of-pocket costs that go into a lot of products that come from the research of public funding. And that's something to take into account as well. Another instance where we could be, as a lot of people say, paying twice for the drug that we've already paid for. And on top of that, there's, again, ensuring that there's as little barriers to the global access to a lot of these essential drugs that Canadians develop and they fund, to ensure that they are not being priced at a very high cost, and allowing some form of regulation with the manufacturing companies that are going to be manufacturing a lot of these products at a very that's coming from a lot of like clinical trials and basic research trials that come from public funding as well.
I like the point that you brought up, Sterling, about all Canadians will receive the vaccine based on what our Prime Minister has said, but there are many undocumented workers who are here, or many workers who are not Canadians here. We've seen, I believe in the Niagara area, where there's a lot of agriculture, where there's basically migrant camps where they work in the agricultural industry. They haven't been covered by a lot of protections so far, and they are being very heavily hit by COVID. And so, since this is the student panel on health equity, one way to have health equity is to provide vaccines during a pandemic to everyone in the country, regardless of their status, because we can't truly build up a community if one of the most exposed groups is still being so harshly affected.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important to remember that these people who are maybe in these migrant camps, they're the least capable of affording to not work during the pandemic. So that can doubly increase their exposure risks. It creates like a double-edged sword for them.
I just wanted to, before I know we're running short on time, but to address your previous question, Lindsay, when you were saying that, have there been any actions done for the University of Toronto specifically to try to improve access to a lot of medications through research? This is something that's been ongoing. It's an ongoing effort by University of Toronto students, and there are a lot of different ways to try to improve equitable technology transfer access. And one of those is the Equitable Technology Access Framework that at the University of Toronto chapter at UAM will be pushing for, and is really excited to talk to a lot of academic researchers, as well as administration from University of Toronto as well, with the main goal to not just improve global equitable access, but promote the development of health technologies for U of T researchers, but also to really improve the transparency of a lot of health technology transfer that goes on, to ensure that the pricing of the medications that arise from this research is equitable globally.
Thank you so much to our three panelists, Nagin, Yasmin, and Sterling. It was a pleasure for all of us to be a part of this, and thank you to all of our participants and attendees. We wish we had more time to discuss more, but our panel has now concluded. There will be a 15-minute break before the next panel. So good job to all the panelists, and thank you all attendees for listening. Thank you, Stephanie.